Welcome and thank you for joining us for this episode of Planning Successfully. I'm your host, Matt Thiry. I'm joined in studio today by two of my colleagues, Lee Drake and Elizabeth Lindsey. Welcome, Lee and Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Lee and Elizabeth and I are all shareholders with the law firm of Davis Matthews and Quigley. In case you're listening for the first time, my practice focuses on business law, business litigation, and fiduciary litigation, as well as providing mediator and arbitrator services. I'd like to take a moment and allow Elizabeth and Lee to introduce themselves and give us a brief overview of their respective practices. Elizabeth, if you'd lead us off, please.
Sure. I'm Elizabeth Lindsey, and I practice family law. I typically represent family members who are close business owners or have executives who have deferred compensation practice, executive benefits. And so we deal a lot in what we're going to talk about today with corporate issues as it affects divorce.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. And Lee, if you'd please give us a little intro into yourself as well.
Okay, I'm Lee Drake, and I have been in Atlanta for around 30 years, practicing in the estate planning and family succession planning practice. And like Elizabeth, our practice is dealing primarily with owners of closely held businesses, and our job is to help them transition ownership of that business from one generation to the next, which involves consideration of all sorts of issues like taxes and shareholder agreements and liquidity planning for the ultimate taxes, estate taxes that may be owed at the time of death.
Okay, thanks, Lee. You can learn more about the three of us and the other attorneys at Davis Matthews and Quigley by visiting our website, which is www.dmqlaw.com. Okay, I wanted to give a brief introduction into today's topic and then dive right into the conversation. Today we're going to discuss divorce, disability, and death, and how those issues can significantly impact a business. No one really likes to consider the possibilities of divorce, disability, or death. These are often events of personal and business crisis. However, the impact these issues can have on a business can be somewhat mitigated by planning in advance. The goal of today's show is to draw attention to how these issues can create havoc in a business or even destroy a business if proper effort is not devoted in planning. As is the case with most legal issues, being proactive can help avoid a lot of the problems arising out of life's unfortunate events. With that, I'd like to go ahead and start into the issues involving divorce. Elizabeth, you oftentimes deal with business owners in a divorce context or business executives in the divorce context. Give us a little of an overview or a flavor of some of the issues that you may run into as a business owner or business executive.
So when you find yourself in a divorce situation, one of the first questions you're going to have to ask yourself is, what is marital property and what is separate property? Because the courts will divide marital property. And I tell people generally that's what you've acquired during the marriage from the sweat of your brow. And non-marital property or separate property is what you might have brought into the marriage, been gifted during the marriage, or had a third party give you some or inherited during the marriage. So what happens, I see, in the corporate world is with closely held business owners and family businesses is that they may have a really nice piece of separate property which would not be subject to division incident to a divorce, but by their actions through their marriage have created a piece of that may become marital property, or all of it may become marital property. So what I find that my business owners have an issue is determining what they had prior to the marriage, what they might have been given from their family, and have they maintained it separately. And then with all that, you get into all kinds of questions about how do you divide that up and how do you provide liquidity and how do you value it, and those are really complicated issues.
So for the business owners that are listening or the business executives that may be listening that have not yet been through a divorce and aren't sure what you're talking about when you're saying separate or marital property, we're talking about concepts of what is available in a divorce context to the marriage to be equitably divided between the parties. So you have your property division issues, and then you have alimony issues, which are separate from that. And what we're focusing on right at the moment are equitable division. So right. the splitting up of the marital pie into pieces and dividing it out amongst the two spouses.
That's right. That's what I'm trying to, that's what those terms mean. And I know they're confusing if you haven't heard them before. And it's not typical in a corporate context that you're going to be talking about what you acquired during the marriage or what you had premaritally or inherited.
And sometimes these issues can be quite tricky as far as partially separate, partially marital, and the different actions that you could take to change one thing to another, especially separate into marital.
Right. And that's one of the things that, if you're a family business owner and want to pass on your assets to your next generation and you don't know if they're going to stay married or not, it's really important to talk to a lawyer to figure out how best to do that, to preserve it as a non-marital asset if that's your intent. And there are ways to do it. But a lot of times people pay no attention to that, and then they find themselves years later sorry that they've got a big mess that messes up the entire family business.
Right. So we're only going to be able to scratch the surface of some of these issues during a half-hour show today, but let's talk a little bit about what you just led into, which is what types of things can you do to plan in advance to prevent something that's either separate property from becoming marital property, or to protect a business owner from having issues in a divorce. Because as you know, we've both been involved in a fair amount of litigation work. In a divorce case, there's a fair amount of discovery, and a lot of business owners don't like when their partners get a divorce because all of a sudden they get a lot of requests for information, documents, and other information that is pretty invasive. You want to know every single thing about every little bit of the business, financials and all. And, how can you help to prevent some of these issues from being as much of a problem in the future by planning in advance? And I think both you and Lee deal with this concept in the form of prenuptial agreements and buy-sell agreements within a context. And Elizabeth, you made a good point earlier about having a divorce lawyer look at corporate documents so that you can address some of these issues without unknowingly stepping into the wrong puddle. So Lee, you want to give us kind of like a quick overview of, what do you do in a prenuptial agreement? Lee, both of you jump right in on this one, but what do you do in a prenuptial agreement to try to help a business owner avoid issues with respect to a divorce?
Let me give a little background, step back one step, and sort of give you the perspective that I normally am dealing with clients. In many cases, we'll have a family that has owned a closely held business, and the parents are involved in the business. The children are now involved in the business, and we're doing estate planning on the front end, trying to do what we can to mitigate the estate tax exposure. And in most of those cases, it involves transfer of ownership of that business down to the next generation. And our goal is to do that in the most tax-efficient way. And you have to, in doing that, take into account the possibility that there will be a divorce among the children at some point in the future. Elizabeth, the divorce rate now is what?
It's at least 50%.
50%. So if you have 3 children, there's a very good likelihood that one of those 3 children will go through a divorce at some point in their life, unfortunately. So what we have to do is not only deal with the client in terms of how do we efficiently transfer those ownership interests, but also what happens after those interests are transferred. As Elizabeth said, marital property typically does not include property that is transferred by gift to someone. So if I give an interest in a business to a child, the typical rule would be that that interest is not marital property. It's separate, not subject to equitable division. But unfortunately, as Elizabeth has said, you can convert that into a marital asset. So what we do in counseling these clients is to say, all right, we've got to take into account the likelihood that there's a divorce. So how do we address that? We can go to the child, if the child has not been married yet, and say, if there is a marriage, you have to enter into a prenuptial agreement, which will protect the family business from a divorce scenario. If they're already married, then it becomes more problematic. It's difficult to go to a young child who is already married and say, we're going to ask you to ask your spouse to sign a postnuptial agreement, which can be done after the marriage. And that can, in many cases, destroy a relationship. So we try to avoid that if we can, but in many cases we can't. So if the child says, I'm not comfortable in going that route, then what the parent will typically do is say, well, I'm uncomfortable in making the transfer directly to you right now. So what we can do then is impose a trust over that ownership interest, and as long as that asset is held in that trust, it should be protected from a creditor claim, including a divorcing spouse. So there are levels of protection that we can impose on these transfers, and prenuptial agreement or postnuptial agreement being the first level, trust being the second level. And if we conclude that that there's very little likelihood of a divorce, or we can take other steps involving shareholders agreement to restrict transfers. Then we can make the transfer outright to the child. Same thing applies with people that are in business together that are unrelated. If I'm going into business with someone, I would want to know what would happen to that other partner of mine's investment in our business if they go through a divorce. So for business owners that are not family members, a divorce can also enter into the equation as to what would happen to that business if a divorce occurred among one of those owners. And we see that a lot.
And you're dealing with two separate issues here. You're dealing with preservation of the business itself,
right,
and how the business ownership is structured. So you don't necessarily want to be a business partner with your partner's divorcing spouse, but you're also dealing with issues within the divorce of the valuation of the marital estate. So are these a part of the marital estate's one question, and then can the spouse end up with a partial ownership interest in the business is a secondary question. And Elizabeth, I think we were discussing earlier today, usually courts will appreciate and uphold a restriction in a stock restriction as far as the shareholders agreement goes and the share certificates. However, valuation issues are a whole different story as far as the buy-sell. If you can agree to sell your shares back to the corporation in the event of a divorce, and you could have a valuation set, but the court doesn't necessarily have to respect and honor for the purposes of valuing the marital estate.
That's right. And so you can find yourself doing a full-blown business valuation that can be extremely extensive, and for your partners, you're finding yourself with every single document that the corporation has, all their tax returns, their business records, their profit and loss statements, their general ledger, just a full disclosure and a disruption to the business to have to produce all those documents. But that happens in a divorce, especially if there's not a carve-out like a prenuptial agreement or some other form of document, that a trust or something that prevents it from entering into the marital estate. But when you're entering into a business relationship with someone, you need to realize that in the event of a divorce of one of the partners, there's going to be a huge amount of disclosure. We often have confidentiality agreements to protect the confidence of that information and try to protect the other partner's private information, which is really not subject to the partner's divorce. But it's a very time-consuming and very disruptive process if you're the business owner going through a divorce.
And what we also see is, assuming that the restrictions in the shareholders agreement are respected by the court, then no transfer of those interests can occur to the divorcing spouse, but the owner of the interest could be required to pay that spouse an amount of money equal to their interest in that marital interest in that asset, which could impose significant liquidity problems to not only that partner, but that partner then is going to turn to the primary source of their income, which is the business, and that can disrupt the overall structure, compensation structure of the business, and can create significant issues among the partners that are not going through the divorce, trying to assist that divorcing co-owner in satisfying his or her obligations to their divorcing spouse.
And Lee, to give you a simplifying example for the listening audience, if you have a business that comes in with a valuation of $1 million and you only have $500,000 of other assets, and you've got to divide that out and come up with some capital to pay your spouse because he or she can't take the corporate interest, then you've got to come up with a way to find the money to provide in lieu of the stock ownership or the business ownership. And that creates difficulty within the marital case, the divorce case, and it also creates a lot of business issues with the other partners as well.
That's right.
A lot of these issues, I think, even though divorce probably isn't along the lines of death and disability, it does present a lot of similar problems. And Lee, I think you and I have seen in quite a few different situations where you have a business, and then you have the estate planning issues, and then you have estate ownership and transfer of the business ownership interest to the planned beneficiaries, and how that sometimes has its faults as well. Can you talk a little bit about how if you don't plan ahead of time and you end up having your spouse or your children ending up with a business interest, how that can interplay with the business as well.
Well, a good example is not only just in the divorce itself, but also the usual case where a divorce occurs with children from that marriage, and the business owner then will remarry, and you have what we call a blended family situation at that point, and you've got children from the first marriage who are looking to the parent to provide a succession plan for them, with the parent now married to yet another spouse, and that spouse will also be expecting support from that business asset at the same time. So that can create a significant amount of complexity in trying to plan for the succession of that business, and it can create significant tax issues for us because we end up with being forced under today's tax laws to incorporate the new spouse into the estate plan, which could put the children's interest in that business at risk, or at least deferred until the surviving spouse dies. So all of those issues have to be addressed up front, especially in an intra-family structure where we're trying to accommodate the needs of the children from the first marriage and the needs of the second and sometimes third spouse.
And Lee, you would agree also that issue is even more complicated when one of the children, whether it be from the blended family or the original children from the first marriage, are involved actively in the business. You have some children that are involved in the business and some children that aren't involved in the business, and how you have to deal with not only the ownership structure, but the family structure, and trying to preserve some sort of semblance of a family feel to the family situation.
That's right. The sibling rivalry can be a significant issue for families that own a closely held business. And trying to assist a parent in making sure that the business survives by involving the child that has been involved in the business over their lifetime, but then at the same time treating the other children who haven't been involved in the business fairly in an estate plan is a difficult thing to do. A lot of times we'll incorporate life insurance into the plan to pay out basically the children that are not involved in the business. It's unfair to the employees of the business to put them in the middle of a sibling dispute among who controls that business. So the key to this is to address all of these issues on the front end as opposed to not addressing them and then having all of this occur after the death of really the most controlling person in the whole structure, which would be the original owner. They can typically keep those issues at bay, but if they're not there anymore, those issues become very problematic and can put the whole business at risk.
Right. So they work their entire lifetime for a business to create, grow, and they have something to pass on in a legacy format. And if they don't plan accordingly, their entire hopes and dreams of what they had worked for all their lives can essentially evaporate in a short period of time.
And we have seen it happen more than once, unfortunately.
And you see also with situations where you have folks that try to DIY some of this stuff. Elizabeth, I'm sure you've seen some DIY prenups that just didn't cut muster. The other side of it also, Lee, you and I have been involved in situations where business owners have tried to draft their own buy-sell agreements in the event of a death of a partner and had some life insurance tied to that. And the drafting of those documents was not clear. There was ambiguity within those documents. Well, one of the partners unfortunately passed away, and then the surviving spouse was left in a situation with litigating against her husband's former partner in order to try to obtain what she was supposedly going to get through that process. So a lot of these issues you can deal with on the front end, but you need to make sure you're dealing with them through somebody that knows what they're talking about and has done this before, as opposed to trying to DIY this yourself or pull some forms off the internet, especially with state-specific issues.
Oh, absolutely. And, Lee and I have been involved in many cases, even when he's helping me on a divorce case or I'm helping him address some of these issues. And his planning is that they're very complicated issues, and you really need to look at it from every state-specific issues and what all is involved. We were talking, when he was talking about active management by some of the children and not the other children, it raises the issue, too, in a divorce case, that even if you had the most pristine stock ownership as separate property, if one of those children, adult children, is working in that business, then the spouse may be able to claim an issue of marital property because of their active management and work in that business. And so, there you're going to need to start addressing compensation and other issues to...
Right, whether the compensation is actually the equivalence of what their work is worth or if their ownership interest is a part of that.
That's right. And so, this is very complicated. And, the best planning is to deal with it up front. If anything, anybody can take away as a business owner is that if you've got a family business, you need to really get your documents drafted well and have somebody look at them from a divorce point of view, from a death and disability point of view, and an estate planning point of view.
And also a business point of view in the sense if you have a key man that's involved in the business and they have the institutional knowledge of the business, if that person were to go through a situation, if they were to pass away, for example, can this business continue on? Has that knowledge been passed to one or more of the other people involved in the business so that that business can continue to run? Is there continuity here, or does this business come apart at the seams because the person that was the business is no longer there?
And that's something that we see a lot. We are more aware of the interplay between the divorce area and the estate planning area simply because of the nature of our practice. And we will see in many cases a lot of well-drafted estate planning documents that accomplish the tax objectives but do not accomplish or address the risk of divorce that is out there and in many cases could impact that planning scenario. So and vice versa from Elizabeth's perspective. So we try to address that. A lot of the clients dismiss that in some cases because they haven't gone through a divorce. But if you live long enough and have enough children, the likelihood is, unfortunately, divorce will impact your family. Right. So there's no getting around it, unfortunately.
And Lee, I think that's sort of the interesting thing about all three of these topics with death, disability, and divorce. No one really wants to talk about these issues. These are not the fun topics to address. These aren't, this isn't I'm growing my business and I'm devoting my time and effort toward the widget I'm making or the idea or the service I'm selling. This is sort of dealing with the stuff on the backside of things to protect. And sometimes, unfortunately, business owners aren't thinking proactively on all of these because they're focused on the business. And their focus on the business is what makes their business great, but it's also their Achilles heel if they're not dealing with the planning on the front end as well. And a lot of the documents that are available, I think, they're custom to your situation. Business A and business B could be very different businesses and have very different business needs. They could have very different needs as far as estate planning. They may or may not have a taxable estate today. They may have one in the future. There are a lot of issues that I think are very specific to your situation, and I think that's where having somebody with a firm like ours that has the knowledge on both sides, the estate planning, the business planning, and the divorce practice, provides a benefit that others may not be able to obtain through some other sources. And I think that Lee, that just drawing out a little bit more on what you're talking about there, I think one of the benefits that I enjoy most about our firm is the team atmosphere that we have. And I think that we all have the ability to rely on practitioners of different experience and different expertise that it basically enhances each one of our own practice areas. If I have an issue in a business litigation case that involves tax, I know I can walk down the hall and Lee is a wealth of knowledge to me. And likewise, Elizabeth, I know you have a lot of tax issues that come up through the divorce, and the tax planning group in our firm is quite helpful in that sense. The business depth of knowledge helps the divorce. The divorce planning helps the estate planning. So I think if you look around our firm and you look at our practitioners, you see that there's a very, very good team effort here, and it's a very beneficial team when you're talking to closely held owners of closely held business owners and executives that need those types of services.
I totally agree. And so one of the things that, we do, I think, really well is that when we have a family business and we're talking about how we're going to divide up in the divorce and provide for all these issues, we cover the bases for our clients so that hopefully they won't get whipped, so that hopefully all the issues are addressed. And we've, done a really good job securing those issues for our clients because we've been able to use the corporate experience we have and the tax experience we have and the trust experience we have at our firm. And it's a very good team effort that puts out a really good comprehensive product for our clients.
That's right, and over the years we have seen a lot of different circumstances that lead us to be able to provide advice for a client just starting out in a new business opportunity or starting out in a new marriage, and I think that experience lends itself to being able to, as Elizabeth said, provide a comprehensive analysis of what the client may want to consider and how that could impact what they plan on doing in the next during their entire work lifetime.
Right. And so, Lee, you mentioned a moment ago starting out. Obviously, if you're considering starting a business, you need to start thinking about these things today on the front end. If you're already in business, it's not necessarily too late for you either. You can go ahead and address these issues. You just have to get a plan in place, and you need to work on that plan to make sure that it's taken care of. The worst time to try to address this plan is while one of these crisis situations is going on. I mean, you can't in a divorce context, you can't fix the problem in the middle of the divorce.
Absolutely not. No. Once in the divorce world, once you file for divorce, there are orders in place that you're not allowed to make a lot of changes, and so that can prevent you from doing the planning that you could have done on the front end.
And these plans can take years to implement. It's not that someone can come in and we can implement a plan to transfer ownership of a very valuable asset, a business, down to the next generation within a week or two. It takes years to implement these plans, so it's very important to begin the work on the front end and get a system and a plan in place and implement that on a regular basis, so that everyone knows the direction that the business is going, the ownership is going, and they can adjust their lifestyle accordingly.
Right. So whether you're a startup, you're a business that's been going on an ongoing concern for a couple of years, or you're a $50 million a year in revenue, you can still come back and address these issues. It's just being proactive to make sure that you get them addressed ahead of time. We're running out of time here. I wanted to, I think, Lee, you just dealt with the fact that, you have varying levels of complexity. Some of these plans go for many years in order to be able to implement the plan. Some of these on a young company, you put the plan in place and it implements itself over a period of time, so you don't have as much on the long term as you need on something that you're coming back to after the fact. So the more proactive you are, the easier it is to implement. If you come back in later after the fact, it takes more time to unwind a little bit of what you've already done as opposed to doing it from the start. But as you can tell, these issues are very complex, and they can vary greatly depending on the specific needs. We've only really scratched the surface, I think, on some of these issues. I know that each of these issues, really, you could have much more in-depth conversations about each, but with a half-hour show, we're somewhat limited. I hope we've shed some light on some of these often overlooked but very important issues that have significant impact on a business. I would like to thank Lee and thank Elizabeth for joining me today and being a part of this conversation. And thank you, the listeners, for joining us on this episode of Planning Successfully. You can learn more about DMQ and its attorneys at www.dmqlaw.com. You can follow DMQ on Twitter at DMQLaw. You can follow me on Twitter at Matthew Thiry. You can reach us by telephone at 404-261-3900. Thanks again, and thanks for joining us, and we hope you will join us again for another episode of Planning Successfully.